Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone, and we're glad you can attend Attitude's weekly ADHD Experts webinar. Just a little housekeeping, an introductory note before we get started. If you've listened to one of our webinars before, you know we've been experimenting with adding a certificate of attendance. When the webinar ends, a post-event survey will pop up. It will list 3 questions about the quality of the webinar, followed by 3 questions titled Required for Certificate. If you would like a certificate of attendance emailed to you, you should answer those 3 questions. If you don't want a certificate, well then, don't answer them. Now, today's topic is a challenge for just about every parent of a child with ADHD or a learning disability. IEPs and 504 plans are an important tool for helping children succeed at school. Everyone agrees with that. However, getting the right accommodations and services for your child takes a lot of work and effort, and things don't end there. Parents have to make sure that the IEP or 504 plan is meeting the needs of their child. So that requires a whole other level of work and follow-up. We're happy to have expert Susan Yellin here to give parents strategies to monitor, amend, and fine-tune an IEP or 504 to make sure that the accommodations that were discussed in the IEP meeting are being implemented and working. Susan is the Director of Advocacy and Transition Services at the Yellin Center for Mind, Brain, and Education. She's the author of Life After School, a guide for students with disabilities and their families. She's the founding director of the Center for Learning Differences. And lastly, she is a member of the Attitude Medical Review Panel. Just to remind you, you can ask questions of Susan anytime during the webinar. We will try to get to as many of them as we can after her presentation. To download the presentation slides of this webinar, click the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources on the bottom left of your screen. If you don't see the Event Resources tab, you need to refresh the page. So now, finally, let me turn it over to Susan. Susan, great to have you here today to help us with this very important topic, Susan.
Thank you, Wayne. It's always a pleasure to do one of these webinars. I get a great deal of my own pleasure from listening to the feedback from parents. So please don't hesitate if you have any questions or concerns or if something isn't clear. So first of all, congratulations. If you're listening to this webinar, based on the title, chances are you've been successful in getting your child an IEP or a 504 plan. And you take a deep breath. You think it's the end. First, you had realized your child was struggling, maybe with learning or with attention problems. Chances are you spoke to his or her teacher. Maybe you hired a tutor or did some extra work at home to get that homework going. But still, things weren't quite right. Homework was a grind, more than it needs to be, and test taking was a real problem. So, there's to advance my slides. So you did some homework. You learned about Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. I don't think too many people know the full name of that act. And the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, and the IEP that it calls for. You understood why these 2 acts are different, and that's a whole nother webinar. But you realized that your child might well be entitled to services or services and accommodations under one or the other. Of importance, you probably spoke to your child's pediatrician. And if you didn't, next time something arises, you probably should include the pediatrician in your conversations. They're a terrific resource for referrals, and they can sometimes pick up things with your child that you might not have even thought to look for. So I'm all for involving your pediatrician. So you've now realized something's not right, and you decided to take action. You figured out by talking to parents, by talking to your child's teacher, by doing a little research again, Who is a point person? How do you arrange for an evaluation? You decided that an evaluation was an important starting point because it's like prescribing medication without having a diagnosis. You needed to have somebody with expertise look at your child, examine your child, perhaps test your child, and come up with answers as to what was going on. Now, let me just give you a little aside. When I talk about moving from raising the concerns and finding the point person in your school to contact to arrange an evaluation, it's not, sometimes there's an intervening step. Some states, and thank you New Jersey, which always drives me crazy, have an interim step which is requiring the child to be examined by what they call a child study team. So that if you, the parent, raise the issue that there may be a learning or an attention problem with your child, first the district will require the child study team to be a gatekeeper to the evaluation process. So it's not always you think your child needs an evaluation to understand what's going on, and then you jump to an evaluation. There may be this intervening process. Don't let it throw you. It's still moving along the same path. You have a concern, you bring it to the school, they conduct an evaluation, and if there's this intervening process, it doesn't matter in the long run. It just slows things down. So you're going to make a formal request for an evaluation. First thing you have to remember is the times for evaluation, the time limits within which the district has to complete the evaluation start from when you sign a form called Consent to Evaluate. It may have a different title, but the idea is you are giving the school district consent to evaluate your child, and that starts the clock ticking. There are time limits, approximately 60 days under the IDEA. And there are also forms the school's going to give you to fill out. Family history, medical forms. They want to gather as much information. For example, they want to know, is there a trauma in the child's life that could be affecting learning? So they want a sort of a social history. But they will conduct an evaluation. It does take some time, but within that 60 days, they should have completed the evaluation. And let's assume, for purposes of this conversation, that the evaluation showed that your child has a learning or an attention problem. So, next steps. You're either going to meet with your IEP or your 504 team. Now, there can be a preliminary meeting. There may be somebody sitting down with you to explain what the findings were of the evaluation and sort of an informal conversation explaining what's going to happen. In some areas, for example, in New York City, they don't even include the parents in the 504 team meetings. You get a form filled out by your physician or you submit an evaluation, and the team meets without the parents in most cases. So it's very variable. And we'll talk a little bit later why it's more clear as to what goes on in the IDEA as opposed to Section 504. But you've evaluated. And they set up an IEP or put in place a 504 plan, and you all breathe a sigh of relief. Things are going to be fine now. The school has figured out what's going on. They've come up with a plan. They've set goals. They've put in place some accommodations and maybe some services, something like speech or occupational therapy, and things are going to be fine. And you, as the parent, heave a sigh of relief. Everything's going to work. Ha! As a parent, I guess I should have known better, and I'm guessing you guys should know better, but I'm telling you, it's never that easy. What happens next? You start to see clues that maybe things are not quite right. Your child's grades, which were one of the concerns that you had in the beginning, aren't improving. Maybe they're even going down. You start to get notes or comments at meetings from your teacher. Academic performance isn't improving, or maybe it's getting worse. Things aren't right. But most hurtful to a parent is that your child is concerned. The kind of comments you can get are, everybody else in my class is smarter than me, or I'm in the worst reading group, or I hate school, it's no fun, it's too hard. These are the things that tear a parent apart. Or everything can be quiet, but you as the parent are seeing emotional or behavioral issues. These can be as simple as a stomach ache, a headache, they don't want to go to sleep, maybe they can't get up on a school day where that was never a problem before. New issues around homework or test taking or studying. Homework that wasn't a problem now becomes a problem. You see signs of test anxiety. A child can develop all kinds of nervous habits the day before a test. There can be other signs of stress around school. They never were forgetful. They never left their bag home. They never forgot their homework. And suddenly things are not going as smoothly. They can actually refuse to go to school or, make up a reason why they don't want to. These are difficult to sometimes parse out, but as a parent, you will know that something is not right. Your child is not behaving as in the way that you would hope a child who's happy and doing well in school would be behaving. So that's a clue for you. It may be that the goals in the IEP are not being met. Now, people don't talk a lot about goals. They're cumbersome to read. They're very detailed. Johnny will achieve mastery in this skill 80% of the time. It's just your eyes are going to glaze over. I know mine have. But it's possible that the goals are not being met. So you might want to go back, look carefully at the goals that are in the IEP, and realize that if Johnny is supposed to master something and he doesn't seem to have a clue, perhaps that goal is not even close to being met. Or it's possible that a goal that seemed appropriate when the IEP was created no longer reflects the skills your child needs. An example would be a child whose goals are very heavy on reading. They went into the process of the IEP with what was diagnosed as a reading disorder. And the goals were very reading heavy. And things are getting somewhat better in reading, but now math has cropped up as an issue. And the IEP is weak on math goals. Well, it wasn't the most urgent issue at the time that the IEP was created, but now perhaps they need to be addressed. So these kinds of things can happen. The goals that were terrific before just somehow or other aren't. So, as in so many ways, being a parent requires that you wear many hats. So you put on your detective hat and you speak to your child. Now that may work with an 11-year-old, not so much with a 6-year-old. But depending on your child's age, she may be able to tell you, is she getting the accommodations or services that she's entitled to get? An example would be if she's supposed to get time and a half and a quiet place for her examinations, which is very common in a 504 plan, and you ask her, and she can say, well, no, they said they don't have a room for me, or the teacher's too busy, or they don't have somebody to proctor that, so I'm taking the exams with the rest of the class. That's a red flag for you. It may be that they're giving her work which doesn't feel right. It's not appropriate. Part of your IEP may well have been that she's supposed to get a reduced quantity of, let's say, math problems, so that she's not repeating 30 arithmetic problems on one page. That's too stressful for her. Maybe she'll get 10 problems. But she's getting the same handouts as everybody else, and that's not okay. Now, it may be that you can ask a child, you're supposed to go to speech with Miss Smith. Is Miss Smith coming to the classroom and pulling you out to go work on her with speech? And your answer may well be, her answer to you may well be, no, I don't know where she is. I haven't seen her in 3 weeks. But many children can't report on these issues, especially younger ones, or they don't fully understand the ramifications of these issues. So that's a little more trying. You might want to start your detective work, if your child can't fully help you on this, by speaking to your child's teacher. It's much less common now. It used to be more common. But there would actually be teachers who don't have copies or have not read copies of the IEP or 504. Are they familiar with it? This can be a real problem in middle school or high school where a teacher could have 120 students during the course of a day. They may not really focus on the fact that 18 of their students have IEPs and certainly may not have read those IEPs. But let's assume that the teacher has access to the IEP, has read it. Does he follow it? If the child's supposed to get extended time, if the child's supposed to sit in his seat near the teacher and the teacher is supposed to cue the child with a gentle tap on the shoulder if it looks like his or her attention is wandering. What about services and supports outside the classroom? Is the teacher aware the child should be pulled out for math support? Or maybe there should be a push-in math specialist coming into the classroom? Is that happening? Is the teacher monitoring it in any way? Can they report to you about what's going on? And let's assume that everything's going fine, and the teacher says, no, I've read it, I follow it, he's getting the supports, well, then how can he explain the issues your child is still facing? And does this make sense to you? Nobody knows your kid better than you do. And if there are problems, are these problems that can be fixed in the classroom? If it's an accommodation or a support that can be provided in the classroom, maybe bringing it to the teacher's attention and talking to the teacher about it. Again, the example we used about where the child should sit, cueing the child, putting the homework in more than one format so the child can access it. For example, having the child write it down may not work. Putting it on the board, giving the child a handout with the homework, having a homework buddy help. These are things that can be done in a classroom. So it may well be that the teacher can be very helpful. Are the issues that you're seeing issues that can be fixed by the teacher? What if there's a specialist in reading or in math required, and that individual just isn't showing up or isn't doing what is needed to be done? It may be that the teacher can't help with that. So these are the kinds of things that you want to talk to your teacher about. Okay, so you've finished your conversation with the teacher, and things are not 100% yet. So what can you do now? Well, first of all, you go back to the IEP in 504 again and make a list of what your child should be getting. Make it detailed. Where are things falling short? Is she supposed to be getting specialized reading instruction? Is he not getting extra time? Is there supposed to be a paraprofessional in the classroom to help your child, and that individual's attendance is spotty? What kinds of things are supposed to be there or are supposed to be happening that are not going on? If, again, things aren't fully satisfied, you now have a sort of a laundry list of what the problems are, you're going to want to go back to the head of the IEP or 504 team. You probably know who this is because you've had some meetings before. If not, or if staff has changed, go back to the principal or the guidance counselor. Your goal in this step is to figure out where things are falling short. Here are some of the common issues that can happen when a student's 504 or IEP isn't working properly. Easy one is the IEP or 504 is fine as it's written, looks great, everything in paper is great, but it's not being followed. Why? Well, maybe the kind of class setting isn't available. A common kind of class setting for kids who are struggling with learning might be a co-taught class with two teachers, a regular instructional teacher and a special ed teacher who supports that child and others in the classroom with learning challenges. So now there's somebody who can take your student aside, do a little extra support, but yet they're in a regular classroom. It's a great arrangement when it's available. Maybe your child is entitled to certain reading instruction, but the school has a shortage of specialists. There's a big difference between a quote-unquote reading teacher and someone who's certified in a specific reading modality, something like Orton Gillingham or one of the other ways that people can teach reading in a multifactorial way. It's also possible that they have just the right person, but that person is out sick or on maternity leave. A lot of young people are teaching, and young people tend to have kids. Whether it's on maternity or paternity leave, that could be an issue. So there, the problem is implementation of a perfectly fine IEP or 504. Another issue could arise if the IEP or 504 plan is being followed, but it just doesn't provide enough support or the right accommodations for your child. Maybe the academic supports seem to be inadequate. How do you know that? Well, let's go think back to the very beginning when we were looking to see if there was a problem in the first place. Grades aren't going up, or maybe they're going down. There may be behavioral changes or comments from your child. Things aren't going well in school. They hate their reading group. They're not learning anything. This homework is too hard. So whatever the IEP or 504 provides doesn't seem to be adequate at this point in time. Don't forget, those are often made up in, let's say, May of the preceding year. It's now getting into November, and that's been a while, and things just aren't quite the same. Children don't remain the same from moment to moment. Or maybe your IEP provides for pull-out sessions, speech and language, reading instruction, a resource room, but they're poorly scheduled and they're interfering with your child's favorite part of classroom time. Or maybe they're interfering with key instructional time so that every time your child's pulled out for reading, they miss a math lesson. Or maybe the goals are not appropriate. Now, that's a tough one because, apologies, it's cold and flu season here in New York. If the goals are not appropriate, you will know because some of the things that you're looking for in other areas, like behavioral issues, academic progress, particularly academic progress, if your child has either exceeded those goals or the goals are too difficult, your child is striving to achieve something that he or she simply isn't ready for, that could be possible. We talked before about goals may be heavy on reading when it turns out that math is now cropping up as an issue. So looking carefully at those goals, as we suggested early on, might be a very helpful thing because that could be a common issue. But as I'm sure all parents know, not everything that goes wrong is academic. Behavioral issues sometimes get lost when you're putting together an IEP or a 504 plan. Some students, this happens a lot with older students, they may refuse extended time or pull-out services or other supports. They don't want to be different. If everybody is taking their test in the same place, they want to take it in the same place. They don't want to be pulled out of class. It makes them feel uncomfortable. Although in a segmented high school setting where people move from class to class, people may not notice who's where at what time. Also with any child, there can be problems with transportation. IEPs frequently provide for busing. There can be a problem with after-school activities. Does the support service your child needs come after school because of a shortage of teachers or a scheduling problem, and he or she can't participate in a team that they want to participate in? So that's a problem. So, you've been a detective now. You've identified the likely cause of the present problem. How do you resolve it? Well, it depends on what kind of problem is going on. If an IEP or 504 isn't being followed, if it's not sufficient or appropriate as written, or if it involves the problems you're seeing involve behavioral difficulties or refusal to cooperate. If the IEP or 504 isn't being followed, you should have already spoken to the teacher and see if he's aware of the IEP and 504 and is doing what is possible within the classroom. If the teacher isn't cooperative or the problem is beyond the control of the teacher, you then go up one level, speak to the principal, the IEP or 504 team leader, or the guidance counselor. It doesn't happen often, but sometimes a school will fail to comply with an IEP or 504, and the failure is either willful, which is very unusual, or systemic. And by systemic, I mean that district, because of budget constraints or an educational philosophy, may not have certain kinds of instruction. And the only solution in these cases where it's a sort of a school-wide or district-wide solution that's needed is to possibly consider legal action. Now, I'm a lawyer. I think legal action can be very effective, but as we'll talk in a minute, it's not always the right solution, and it's not always easy. So, sometimes you can change an IEP or 504 without a meeting. In general, when there's a minor change, fairly well consistent with the current IEP or 504, and this would be something like increasing or decreasing the frequency of existing services, speech 3 times a week, or maybe instead of 3 times a week, twice a week, because it's interfering with things. That's an easy change, not generally contested, or maybe changing a service or adding an accommodation. Maybe your child needs assistance with note-taking, or you've provided for extended exam time but not a quiet location, and his attention issues make that suddenly necessary. Or maybe his teacher doesn't really like laptops, but if the IEP provides it, that teacher would permit a laptop for note-taking. I mean, nowadays, who can imagine a teacher who wouldn't? But let's assume that there's some teacher who doesn't like it. These are the small changes that the IEP or 504 team can put in place without a meeting. And those are easy, and those are important to do, and by all means, move ahead on them. Sometimes you need a new meeting. Now, understand that parents have the right to call an IEP meeting at any time, not just once per year. It won't happen the next day. They have to bring everybody together. But don't let the school ever say to you, well, we just had a meeting in May. I don't know why you need a meeting now. Your comeback should be, we'll make the changes I want without a meeting. Or, I understand that the law requires you to provide a meeting when I ask for one. And when would a new meeting be appropriate? If you need a different kind of class setting or a different school, maybe your child really needs a one-on-one paraprofessional in the classroom working with him or her. Or maybe you need substantial revisions to instruction or to the goals, not simply tweaking the amount of time you spend with a specialist, but maybe adding 1 or 2 different specialists. In these cases, put your foot down, get a new meeting, press for it to be held promptly, and get those changes made to the IEP or 504 as soon as possible. Sometimes the IEP or 504 is based on inadequate or improper evaluation. Now remember, we started out with an evaluation, and new evaluations are required at least every 3 years, but parents can request a new evaluation once each year. So let's assume that you had noticed a problem last October. By the time you had your child evaluated, it was, and went through all the process, it was the end of January. Your IEP meeting was in March. The IEP was put in place in March, and now it's this present school year. Well, maybe the evaluation isn't appropriate at this point. Or maybe it was kind of a weak evaluation. You sort of said, well, if this is what they see, this is what they see. But it's not really resolving anything. You also always have the right to get an IEE. IEE is an abbreviation for Independent Educational Evaluation. There are circumstances where you can actually get the school to pay for an IEE. But it's a complicated process, and it requires a bunch of different circumstances being met, but it happens all the time. A new evaluation may show more clearly what's going on, but it's not a quick solution. You have to arrange for the evaluation, have it conducted, call another IEP meeting to consider it, and make changes to the IEP or 504. But it's one option. And of course, behavior. Kids are complicated. It may be that the issues that you're seeing that are causing problems are not academic. Maybe there's a behavioral issue that got overlooked the first time around. The process for examining that is something called a functional behavioral assessment. How's your kid doing in school? How's the behavior going on? And if that FBA, the functional behavioral assessment, shows problems, there is something called a behavioral intervention plan that will be put in place along with the current IEP. So that's another option. We talked earlier about legal remedies. They really are always a last resort. But they may be the only solution. They are time-consuming. Legal resolutions can take many months. There is, fortunately, something called stay put, which is part of the IDEA, the law that governs the IEPs, which means that if the school is, that your child is entitled to their current setting while you resolve things, but sometimes that current setting is not so ideal. So it can swing both ways. Your results in any legal action aren't guaranteed, and you really do need an attorney. Some people use an advocate. That's fine, too. Again, I'm a lawyer. I have my perspective. But there are very specific procedures under the IDEA to follow for legal remedies. Section 504 is always a little different because Section 504 doesn't have its own list of rules and requirements for legal processes. Basically, it says you got to be fair. Well, being fair, most places just apply the same rules they apply for IDEA. But it's not really its own set of guidelines. And that's why I'm sometimes a little vague about what Section 504 requires. So, just to wrap it up, I know I've thrown a lot of things at you guys. You do need to be a detective to parent a child with ADHD or LD. You also need to be a diplomat, and most importantly, an advocate. It's not easy. You're never, quote unquote, done. I learned that as a parent too. But if you pay careful attention and you go step by step and you listen to your child and keep your ears open and eyes, you can do a lot to help your child. Wayne, that's it.
That was great. That really was great. I have to say, I love the step-by-step approach, and it just was very linear and made a lot of sense. And the questions are just as good. So some of them require short answers, maybe some longer. So I'm just going to start reeling these off. Do private schools have to honor an IEP and or a 504?
That's an easy one. Thank you. Basically, IEP, yes, 504, no. The law that 504 comes from relates to places that take money from the federal government. So a public school gets its money in part from the state, which gets that money in part from the federal government. So a public school is covered. A private school, generally not. You may need to do, again, some detective work. If a private school takes money for its lunch program or for something else like that, it could be covered by 504, but not usually. Usually it's... Now, the IDEA, which applies to private schools, you would not get an IEP. You'd get something called an IESP. called an individualized educational service plan. So there's that extra S in there. The other thing is that your private school does not have to cooperate. I've dealt with situations where a private school said, well, that's all fine, but we don't want to deal with it. You don't really have a choice. You as a parent don't really have a choice. The school refuses. They're not required to follow it. So it can be more problematic, but you definitely won't get a 504 in most circumstances. You may get an IESP. The school needs to cooperate with scheduling and finding a place for the services to be provided. A lot of private schools are very cooperative. A lot of them don't want to be bothered.
Is the school district legally required to provide the 504 plan to the teachers? I guess this is addressing the whole issue of a teacher who might not know that the child has a plan.
Again, there's no specific there's no section of 504 that lays out this, the school district must do A, B, C, D. But as a practical matter, how can you expect the teacher to follow a program that she or he has no knowledge of? So, and frankly, a parent would have a copy of the 504. There's nothing to preclude a parent from marching into school. This is my child's 504. You should have been given this by the office. If you haven't been, well, maybe you should go to the office and get it, but this is what you're expected to follow. It's a document that should be circulated, not hidden.
Right.
And the parent can help with that.
Yeah. One mom's writing in about her child is in middle school, and they decided that an IEP or 504 plan after an evaluation is not necessary. They said he is achieving passing grade C's or better, so that he doesn't need a plan. What can I do as a parent? Because she obviously thinks he does.
Ah, dear. I hate these questions only because the answer is frustrating. The IDEA says that a student is entitled to an appropriate education. Appropriate is not perfect. It's not what we as parents want for our kids. Appropriate means if it was a car, it would have 4 wheels, some doors, an engine, a steering wheel, and it would run. It's not going to be a high-end Porsche or Lexus. So it may be that the school district believes that it's doing what's appropriate. However, if I were that parent, assuming that the school district did the evaluation, I might look for an independent educational evaluation, not connected with the school. See what that evaluator says. Now, unfortunately, these are often expensive. And if she's recently had an evaluation with the school within the last year, she might be able to get the district to pay for it. But what's concerning is that once she has that evaluation, it may well find that there's more of a deficit than the district's willing to admit. So first, get to the bottom of it with an independent view of what's going on. She can, at some point, hire an advocate or attorney and basically sue the district and say, you need to provide my child with an IEP. But that's going to create some issues with the district. It's complicated.
Right. Yeah.
Some parents put their child in a private school for just those reasons, which is not a solution. It shouldn't have to be a solution, and it's certainly not available to everybody for many reasons. But it's a hard one to answer because it's not so simple.
Yeah. Maybe this one's simpler. Are 504 plans supposed to be updated annually by parents' request only?
They're supposed to be updated annually. Parents shouldn't have to request it. Ideally, the district will reach out to you and say, we last looked at your 504 plan in May. I need to update, let's do an easy one. You have a 504 plan because the child has an attention problem. The doctor has ordered medication, which sometimes has to be taken in school. They want the doctor to update. You go back to your physician. You get an updated form filled out and present it to your 504 team. and they update the 504.
Mm-hmm.
That's an easy one. But yes, it should be
Okay.
updated every year.
Okay. Who is supposed to be responsible for making sure the 504 plan is being followed? I would think a lot of parents think it's up to the school and the teachers, and that, of course, that's
but
not
that's
true.
asking the fox to guard the hen house. I mean, not to make it in a
Yeah.
contentious way, but the fact remains, if a teacher isn't doing what a teacher's supposed to be doing, if a school isn't doing what a school is supposed to be doing, they might not even know they're not doing it. So what are they going to do? Call the parent and say, well, or an IEP for that matter, your child is supposed to get extended time, but we've been very busy. We haven't had time to set that up. So your child is taking her tests with all the other children and not getting extended time. They're not going to call you and tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even the best schools screw up, and they're certainly not going to come and announce it. So I think it's the parents really have to be vigilant. Unfortunately, it would be ideal. You send your kid off to school and you smack your hands together and you're all done. But it's not that simple.
Right. This is a little weird. I hadn't heard this one before. My son's 504 has a caveat stating accommodations will be provided, quote unquote, if asked by child. For example, quote unquote, break instructions down to smaller parts, if asked. Is this legally the only way for my son to get accommodations, or can we have that caveat removed?
You should have that caveat removed. I'd immediately contact the school. Now, it may be, let me give a caveat of my own, it may be that this is a high school junior who is balking at being involved in this. I don't want this, I don't need this, I'm too, Sometimes that happens, and then the school doesn't really know what to do, so they say if the kid will cooperate. But let's assume we're talking about a third grader who doesn't understand that she doesn't have to cooperate. In that case, absolutely, you call a meeting tomorrow, you tell them that that's not appropriate, that puts the onus on the child, and you can't expect the child to make those calls. You as the parent are requiring them to remove it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's a situation to be firm.
Yes, yeah. A lot of questions about one-on-one aid. How does a child qualify for a one-on-one aid in the school setting as an IEP accommodation? And others have asked, let's see, I've been told that the school doesn't have enough funding for aid for a child. So a lot of one-on-one questions.
Okay. Let's deal with one-on-one briefly. Number one, there's no one rule that guides when a child needs a one-on-one aid. Let me tell you some situations where they arise. If a child is medically fragile or has a significant physical or medical impairment, so that somebody has to keep an eye on that child. If a child has significant behavioral issues, sometimes a kid is a wanderer. Some of the children who have autism spectrum disorders are wanderers. They will literally run if given the opportunity. They need somebody with them at all times. Sometimes a student has really significant learning impairments, but for a variety of reasons, they're in a class that's a little more advanced. They may need a one-on-one aid to provide instruction. So it's not a common support. Most children should be getting the education they need if they're in an appropriate classroom with perhaps a co-taught teacher, a special education teacher in the classroom. One-on-one aids are an exception. There's no standard for it. Most parents who have them for their children, it's not an optional kind of thing. So now let's go to the second question, which is the school says they don't have the money for it. Excuse me, but baloney. If a child truly needs it, then that's not okay. That's not sufficient. The answer to that situation would be, if the school can't afford a one-on-one aid, would they like to pay the tuition for this child in a private school that provides a smaller class and more supervision? That parent might want to speak to somebody to give them some guidance on their legal options. But absolutely, a one-on-one aid, there's no one rule. It's kind of like if you need it, you'll know it. And sometimes the schools themselves say, listen, we're really struggling with Johnny. We really are having problems. We're going to suggest that we put in place a one-on-one aid. So sometimes it comes from the schools, but that they cannot afford something is not a defense to something that's absolutely necessary for a child.
Mm-hmm.
So
can you give a very brief, and I know you said you could do a whole webinar on it, but as you would imagine, a lot of questions about differences between 504s and IEPs. Can you possibly do it briefly?
Yes, I can do it, and I'll try to do it briefly.
Points.
All right. Section 504 is part of a labor law. The labor law, it's literally Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It has sections on public accommodations. It has sections on the workplace. There is a section that says that if someone is receiving services from a school that receives federal money, that individual is subject, that school is subject to Section 504. Section 504 mirrors the Americans with Disabilities Act. So what it says is if you have a disability, and the definition of disability goes on for pages, things like breathing, thinking, concentrating, a lot of things, you are entitled to such accommodations as a person so that you can function as a person without a disability. It's often talked about leveling the playing field. You get that which you will need to function just like somebody who doesn't have a disability. So it's really, it can provide for learning supports. Most often it's sort of started out being used for medical conditions. Then ADHD became a very popular way to use Section 504. If your child has more complicated learning needs, generally you would want to get your services under the IDEA. Unlike 504, which governs what the school must do, IDEA follows the child. That's why IDEA applies in private schools. It applies to every kid. A child is entitled to services if he or she has a disability that impacts their learning. So it can be a learning disability, it can be a physical, there's like 13 categories: orthopedic impairment, visual impairment, hearing impairment, emotional disability, and this wonderful catch-all phrase that a lot of kids with ADHD fall into, which is called OHI, other health impaired. IDEA is very specific about everything. There's a statute, there's pages and pages of federal regulations, every I is dotted, every T is crossed, and parents are a required part of the team, unlike 504. So some places may put the IDEA procedures in place for 504 because they are required to have fair procedures in place, but really IDEA is a much richer law. It requires the parents to be part of the meeting. As I mentioned earlier, 504 doesn't always require that. So I would definitely go for a IEP if my child qualifies. So your child can have an attention problem, not significant learning needs, and the school may say, listen, we don't want to give him an IEP, but we'll give you a 504. You might want to start with that, take what you can get, and see how it's working out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's the difference in a small nutshell.
Is a functional behavioral assessment something the school administers or something that's done through an outside specialist?
The school administers a behavior. Now, you may say, this is nonsense, my child doesn't behave that way. You can get an independent behavioral assessment, but start with the school. One of the good things about any assessments by schools is that they're free. And I say that as somebody who works in an assessment center. So you definitely don't want to pay for it if you don't have to. They're not inexpensive.
Mm-hmm. Another short one. Where would I request an IEE outside the school setting?
Okay. You would use you would talk to your pediatrician. Get the name of someone who does neuropsychological assessments in your community. That's a great resource for a referral. They know who to send you to. They know who's reliable. And that would be where I would go for an assessment, for the name of an assessor. Sometimes local colleges has people who do them, but I would first talk to your pediatrician.
Mm-hmm. Can you get a 504 plan while waiting for the IEP assessment to move forward, since that could take 3 months to implement?
Well, the problem is that technically a 504 also requires some sort of information. It may, again, it depends on where you live. Here in New York City, where I'm speaking from right now, it's a form. You give the form to the child's doctor, they fill it out, it's 2 pages, and that's the end of it. So that's pretty quick. But other places may require, it technically requires an evaluation. So the form that I just spoke about requires that the physician examine the child, determine that there's an attention problem, what would be needed to fix that attention problem, which will be the 504 plan items. So it doesn't work that way. You have to pick a path and go down it.
Yeah.
The school won't go for that, and they really shouldn't. First of all, the school can put something in place without having a plan. It's not formalized, and it's not setting a track record for later on when you're taking the ACT or the SAT. But the fact remains, if they feel that your child really does need extended time on most tests, they can give it while they're working on everything.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't really know that. That's a fine point.
Yeah, they can do, There's no rule that says they can't. They usually won't, but they certainly can.
Can you make a school reimburse for an IEE after it's done?
You can. Wayne, I'm going to do something which isn't too political. I write a blog for my office, and it's the Yellin Center blog. Google it, and when you get to it, there's a search feature on the right-hand side, and put in IEE, and you will find an extensive conversation about what you need to do to get reimbursed for your IEE. I don't usually refer to my own writing outside of Attitude, but it's just on point. Yeah. Again, the Yellin Center blog, search IEE. You will get all the information you need about IEEs.
Okay.
Yep.
Can part of an IEP be switching teachers?
It's
a lot of. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it can be, but they generally won't, because they're not going to. It can provide a teacher who has experience in something or a particular class setting. I've never heard of a school that was willing to do, to name a teacher. It's just impolitic for them. It's not something they're going to do. If there's a problem with a teacher, the place to go is the principal with evidence. Mrs. Smith has been making fun of Johnny because his reading is labored. There's been teasing and she's not addressing it. Oh, that's a whole other subject. Without me making a stink about everything, perhaps we should start by changing teachers. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a bring in cookies and carry a baseball bat behind your back. One of those, you've got to be a negotiator.
Yeah. Do IEPs, I'm sorry to keep doing these rapid fire.
No. This is fun.
Yeah, okay, good. Do IEPs transfer state to state?
Yes, but there's a blog on that too. Put in moving. But the idea is they do transfer, but then the new state is required. You get started with the old IEP, and then the new state is required to have sometimes a new evaluation, but definitely a new meeting. Mm-hmm. But I have details on that too there.
Okay. How does funding work for a student with an IEP? This is a little broader question. Do schools get a set amount for every student with an IEP, or does it depend on what challenges the child has?
They get an amount based on the number of students who have IEP. So it's a per capita kind of thing. And then they can split it up. But what's interesting is that sometimes districts are willing to give you a 504 but not an IEP. Why? Because a 504 is not a funded statute. If a school gives you a 504 plan, they get no money for it, and there's generally no cost to them for accommodations, for certain things like that. So they don't have to report that to anybody. Generally, with an IEP, a district does get money from the state. The state gets money from the federal government, and the reporting requirements go up the chain, just as the money comes down the chain. So and they very carefully pay attention how many children of color are being referred for IEPs, what district is over-referring children, what district seems to be under-referring children. So these are issues that are problems. And yes. So the money, because there's money that comes with an IEP as opposed to a 504, there's also accountability. And that accountability makes everybody a little nervous.
Right. I just want to get this one last question, and I know we're close to the end. If you as a parent identify things that might help your child, but the school pushes back because of budget constraints or something they don't have the structure to support, what are your options?
Your options are to go to a hearing before a state hearing officer if you're now talking about an IEP. The fact that they can't do it because of budget constraints is, did I call it baloney before? That was a good clean word I used. It's baloney. And more importantly, I hear all too often the school can't do it. The school won't do it. Well, the school, again, the standard isn't perfection. The standard is what's appropriate. But if it's what's appropriate and what the child needs, it's not an option. It's not, the school doesn't get to pick and choose.
Yeah. Okay.
All righty?
Yes, I think the hour's up, and everyone, your presentation was excellent, really. I learned a great deal, and the questions were excellent, I thought. So
thank you for your patience, my listeners, and we will talk.
Okay.
Bye-bye now.
Bye. Thanks to all the attendees for being here. Hope you will attend next week's webinar on October 22nd, the last of our ADHD Awareness Month webinars. The topic, Best Life Hacks for Adults and Kids. And that will be, the presenter will be Michelle Novotny, who's excellent. It ought to be a good one, so hope to see you there. Thanks for attending today's webinar, and have a great day, everyone. Take care.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.